At 1 a.m. on September 1st, 1977, Police Constable Carolyn Heaps and her partner arrived at a small home in Enfiled, a village in North London, England. Officer Heaps was young, and she hadn't been on the force that long. She felt a little nervous that night because the station had got a disturbing call coming from this house. Dispatchers had heard a woman screaming on the other line, shouting that things were being thrown at her and her two daughters. And so, Officer Heaps expected that she was stepping in to a pretty serious domestic violence situation. She knocked on the door and was greeted by 47-year-old Peggy Hodgson. Peggy led Officer Heaps and her partner through the house and into the living room. And Officer Heaps soon discovered that they had not been called out to investigate a domestic violence call. In fact, what Peggy told her made very little sense at all, because Peggy said that in the middle of the night, she had heard her daughters, 11-year-old Janet and 13-year-old Margaret, shouting from the bedroom they shared upstairs. Peggy got out of bed and rushed to see what was happening. An armoire was sliding across the floor towards her girls. And then other objects in the room started getting thrown at all three of them. And not knowing what to do, Peggy called the police. Officer Heaps didn't know what to say. She thought the girls must have been having a nightmare, or one of them had thrown something at the other, or the light had played tricks on them and they had seen something that wasn't really there. And then, all of a sudden, a chair in the living room slid across the floor. Heaps and her partner stepped back, looking at each other, having no idea what to do. Heaps' first thought was maybe this family was playing a trick, trying to hoax the police, trying to get attention. And so she searched the entire room for wires to see if someone was maybe pulling the chair, to see if there was any device that could have made this happen, or if one of the children was hiding and they were shoving it unseen. She even found some of the children's marbles and tried to roll them across the floor in the same fashion, thinking maybe there was a strange slant in the wood and the old chair just kind of slid on its own. But the floor was flat and sound, and not even a marble could move like the chair did. Officer Heaps felt confused and a little afraid. She also felt bad because there was nothing she could do, at least at that time. She told Peggy that despite these disturbing things happening in the house, no crime had been committed. So this wasn't a police matter. And she and her partner left, not knowing what to do or who to call. Peggy Hodgson reached out to the Daily Mirror, the most popular newspaper at the time. And soon after, a reporter and a photographer from the Mirror arrived, and they witnessed things moving just like the officers had. And by the end of that day, this little house in Enfiled would become the center of a national story and one of the largest paranormal investigations in British history. The red Jaguar E-Type Roadster immediately stood out as it sped down the Enfiled street. A local resident would later refer to the car as a splash of color in a black and white world. Onlookers watched as the Jag pulled up in front of the Hodgson's house. And when the driver stepped out, they were even more shocked than when they first spotted the car, because many of them half expected a young, handsome banker to emerge, or maybe even a celebrity. But what they saw instead was a 58-year-old man with almost no hair on top of his head, a large mustache that curled up at the end, glasses, and an oversized tape recorder. This was Maurice Grosse, and he was a paranormal investigator. Maurice Grosse did not start his career looking into the paranormal. In fact, he had spent the bulk of his adult life as an extremely successful mechanical engineer and an inventor who held multiple patents. Friends and family said Maurice had a kind of mind that was unlike most people's. They said you could hand him a radio, he could take it apart, put it back together, and then improve it before you even realized what had happened. And Maurice had enjoyed a great career and was eagerly looking forward to a nice, calm retirement with his family. But a year earlier, everything in Maurice's life had irrevocably changed when his daughter, Janet, was killed in a motorcycle accident. After Janet's death, in their grief and anger, Maurice and his family started to have these strange experiences, things they would later refer to as psychic coincidences. And this is what drew Maurice Grosse, a trained mechanical engineer, a scientist at heart, into investigating paranormal activity. So in his retirement, he joined the Society of Psychical Research and now found himself on his first major case. But while Maurice had left behind mechanical engineering, he never gave up his scientific streak. That's what the tape recorder was for. He was convinced that if paranormal activity and paranormal investigators like himself were ever going to be taken seriously, they had to approach their investigations like scientists. They needed to find hard evidence. They needed to record everything, and they needed to eliminate any possibilities that might just be part of the mundane, everyday world. And so Maurice started his investigation in the simplest way he could think. He sat down with the family, shared some tea, and talked about what had been going on. Now, it was September 5th, just 4 days after the phone call to the police had led Officer Heaps to the house and later the Daily Mirror reporter and photographer. But in that 4 days, the story of what was happening inside that house in Enfield had spread all across the UK and made its way to mainland Europe and was starting to catch fire in the United States. And so Maurice knew he was walking into an investigation that already had a lot of eyes on it. But he didn't let that freak him out. He didn't let that change his approach. He just wanted to know what was really happening. And so over the next several days, Maurice conducted a series of experiments. He would stay at the house until late at night, set up his tape recorder, go from room to room, and simply wait and see if anything happened. And one night, just a couple of nights into his research, he heard screaming coming from the top of the stairs. Maurice rushed up the stairs and found Janet, the 11-year-old, trembling in her bed, and the 13-year-old, Margaret, was just staring as though she had seen a ghost. Both girls said something was in the room and something was moving their dresser. Now, this was the dresser that had been moved initially that led their mother to call the police. Maurice was baffled. These two young women, while he thought were smart, clever, and imaginative, two young women who could come up with a scenario in which a ghost was haunting their house, did not appear physically to be able to move this huge dresser in the way that it had been pushed across the room, especially not in the time span that it had taken place. So Maurice noted it, wrote it down in his journal, and quickly interviewed the two girls. But there was also something else at play, something that Maurice didn't really talk about publicly. Maurice was still a grieving father. And so when he heard Janet screaming or saw Margaret looking terrified sitting up in her bed, he couldn't help but drop the paranormal investigator and simply become a caring dad. He was immediately worried about these girls, and he wanted to find a way to help them. And so, over the next few days, he came to realize he was out of his depths as a new investigator of the paranormal, as someone who had never been thrown into any situation like this. He needed help. So he attended a meeting at his Society of Psychical Research and straight up told everyone what he had seen in Enfield and asked for someone to assist him. And in a room full of men eager to learn about poltergeists and demons and possessions and hauntings, one hand shot up. It belonged to a man named Guy Lyon Playfair, who in 1977 was already one of the most famous paranormal investigators in the world. On the surface, Guy Playfair and Maurice Grosse could not have seemed more different. Maurice was the consummate engineer, a man who liked to break things down logically, slowly put them back together, whereas Guy had always been drawn to more creative pursuits. He was an avid musician and had been a writer since a young age. And while Maurice was slowly getting interested in the paranormal, he still remained a skeptic about a lot of aspects of that field. Whereas Guy, after a trip to Brazil, had become quite a spiritualist and a mystic. And he had already written 2 very successful books about the paranormal and even looking at mysticism and magic in South America. And the two men led very different lives. Maurice had been a husband and father for the majority of his adult life, whereas at 42, Guy had no intention of settling down. He'd been engaged a couple times, but he often found himself moving from one romantic entanglement to the next. However, despite these differences, and despite the conflict that would be portrayed between these two men later in film and television, They actually got along really well, and they immediately found common ground. Both men had served in the military, and their shared military background gave them an appreciation for regimented, focused work. Neither of these men would go about this investigation without a plan. And so when Guy arrived on the scene, they worked together to divide their time and energy and figure out how they could get the most out of this investigation so that they could help this family. Because ultimately, despite their different backgrounds and very different lives, that is what drew these two men together. They both cared deeply about the Hodgson family. They wanted to figure out what was going on, and they wanted this single mother and her young children to be safe and happy. And so they set about making recordings. Guy did interviews just like Maurice had, and he soon saw some of the same things that Maurice had witnessed. Chairs moving across the floor, the dresser sliding across the girl's bedroom. And then one night in October of 1977, things started to escalate. While the moving furniture had always been disturbing, it had never really directly threatened anyone. Then one night, while Guy and Maurice were downstairs, they heard screaming from the girl's bedroom. They ran upstairs and found Janet on her bed with a curtain wrapped around her. She was screaming. Margaret was desperately trying to get her free. Guy and Maurice were able to pull the curtain off, and after Janet caught her breath, the two girls explained what happened. They were sleeping calmly and quietly, and then the curtain started to move, and it started to wrap around Janet as though it were strangling her. After that, Guy knew that they had to take things further, and he said it was time to call in a medium. Maurice Grosse did not trust psychics or mediums. He thought at best they were harmless charlatans, and at worst, they were manipulative ghouls feeding off the grief of families who had lost loved ones. But he fully admitted he had no explanation for all of the things he had seen happening in the house in Enfiled. And so when Guy Playfair suggested they needed to bring in more help, Maurice agreed. They reached out to well-known psychic Annie Shaw. She came to Enfiled and visited with the family and conducted a seance. And it did not take Annie Shaw long to determine that there was something malevolent in that house. In fact, she believed there were multiple entities inside the home terrorizing the Hodgson family and specifically targeting Janet. And this is where the case gets very interesting, even in terms of just paranormal research, because Annie Shaw suggested that not only were they dealing with multiple entities, they were dealing with different kinds of entities. One, she believed was the ghost, perhaps of someone who had lived and died in that house. But two, she thought there might be a presence there, either demonic or something else, that had never been human. And so by the time Annie Shaw left, Maurice and Guy and the family felt even less equipped to deal with what was happening in the house. Then, in December, just about 2 months after the first reports from Enfiled, things escalated again, and a man named Bill started to speak. Up until this point, Maurice and Guy had witnessed a number of events they couldn't explain, and now they had a psychic telling them that they were fighting multiple entities, and one of those entities allegedly appeared in the form of a man named Bill. One night, Janet looked as though she were almost in a trance, and when Maurice went to comfort her, he heard a voice emanating from her, a gravelly voice of an older man. And so Maurice quickly rushed to his tape recorder and recorded this man speaking.
I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in a corner downstairs.
This man, who claimed to have died in a chair downstairs at that home, turned out to be a real person. In fact, after the investigation, his son would recognize the voice on the recording as that of his dead father. And so at this point, Maurice Grosse and Guy Playfair fully believed they were dealing with paranormal activity inside this home. And while Guy was convinced they were dealing with a spirit or a poltergeist, Maurice thought they might also be dealing with something else, an unknown power of the human mind, that perhaps Janet was manifesting Bill, that he wasn't necessarily the spirit of the dead man who had lived there, but he was something that her mind had created. Something real, something that was there in the room with them that could not be explained, but something more complex than simply a ghost. Bill continued to appear, and this is when skeptics really got a hold of the case. While there had always been doubters claiming the girls were pulling a hoax, once reports of Bill's voice coming from Janet made it into the public, people attacked. They said this was clearly just a young girl putting on a voice. Maybe she was a skilled actor. Maybe she was a great impersonator. But they didn't think anything on those tapes proved that this dead man was really speaking through 11-year-old Janet Hodgson. When Bill arrived, the family truly started to fracture. Janet rarely slept anymore, and Margaret and the girl's little brother lived in almost constant fear of their own home and of their own sister. Eventually, Janet was removed from the house for a time to undergo extensive psychiatric testing. But doctors couldn't find anything about this 11-year-old girl that suggested she was somehow behind all of the events taking place at the house. Maurice and Guy started to feel as though they had truly failed the family. After a year of research, of bringing in psychics and mediums, psychiatrists, psychologists, even physicists, they still had no clear answer as to how to combat what was happening in that house. At one point, famed American demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren even traveled to Enfield to meet with Guy and Maurice, although they only stayed for a brief time, and according to Guy Playfair, their only true interest was selling books. Finally, in 1979, 18 months after the first disturbances, the house went quiet, and almost as quickly as things started, they stopped. Bill no longer spoke through Janet. Objects and furniture stopped flying across the room, and eventually, everything went back to normal. Now, the family said this was because they had brought over a trusted priest to bless the house. But Guy and Maurice struggled to accept that because this priest was by no means the first religious figure to bless the house. But with nothing else happening, and the family slowly getting back to their regular lives, Guy and Maurice knew it was finally time to leave Enfield. So they said goodbye to the Hodgsons and went back to their own lives. Guy would go on to write a book about their experiences, and the two men would collaborate on paranormal investigations several more times in the future. But in reality, neither of them could ever truly leave Enfield behind. Guy Playfair, who died in 2018, remained convinced that what he, Maurice, and the Hodgsons had seen in Enfield was proof of the paranormal. But Guy never liked to use the term supernatural when discussing it. He said the things they had witnessed in Enfiled, these things that happen in cities and countries around the globe, are simply part of our natural world. We just don't understand them. Maurice Grosse, who passed away in 2006, left behind an unfinished memoir, and in it, while reflecting on his time in Enfield, and especially those skeptics who attacked him and Guy and the family, he had this to say. There appears to be a strong undercurrent of belief that what is not understood does not exist. It may stem from a very deep-rooted fear of the unknown, or just a refusal to recognize anything that cannot be appreciated by our senses. So, what do you think? Is there proof of the paranormal in the Enfiled poltergeist? Or did Maurice Grosse let personal grief and Guy Playfair allow his own beliefs to cloud their judgment? That was Case File 005, the Enfiled poltergeist. Subscribe to Adjunct Horror before the next case file drops. There's a new one every Friday.